afternoon, and thank you all for joining the Working Group 3 meeting for the Extended Day-Ahead Market Initiative. This is specific to the greenhouse gas accounting and cost topics. This is Christina Osborne from ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group. I'll be providing support for the meeting. I'm also joined by Kevin Head, Brian Jacobson, and Phil Pettengill. Kevin Head is the facilitator of this working group. Brian Jacobson is the scribe, and Phil Pettengill is the coordinator responsible for the oversight of all 3 EDAM working groups. As noted on this slide, these meetings are held Tuesdays and Thursdays of each week from 1 to 3. The participation details are available on ISO's public calendar. For today's agenda, Kevin is going to briefly recap the unspecified approach that was presented during yesterday's meeting and then ask the group for their thoughts on the approach. And then Kevin will talk about e-tags and also data reporting in the CAISO markets. And then we have reserved time at the end of the presentation to provide a recap of the discussion and review the topics for the next meeting. As far as meeting reminders, these working groups are intended to be interactive. So please do raise your hand if at any time you have a question or would like to share thoughts and perspectives, and the facilitator will call on you when it's your turn in the queue. And please remember just to introduce yourself at the beginning so that people know who's speaking. And these meetings are recorded. We do post the video files on the working group web pages along with the presentations. The video files, we usually receive those within 2 to 3 business days after the meeting, so we will post those as soon as we receive them from the vendor. And at any time you would like to present at an upcoming working group meeting, these working group meetings are going through mid-March, but if any time you want to present, please reach out to the ISO. There's an inquiry link on the resources slide at the very end of this presentation. Just go ahead and reach out to us, and then we'll coordinate with you on an upcoming meeting. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to Kevin Head.
Thanks, Christina. Appreciate it. Operator, would you mind giving me control just so I can take the slides and just start where we had left off there?
Sure.
Cool. Okay.
There you go.
All right, cool. Well, thanks everybody for joining again today. It feels like it hasn't been that long since we last spoke. They say absence makes the heart grow fonder, so if you're not feeling very fond of me right now, I wouldn't resent you for it. Today's conversation, as Christina outlined, we're going to try to tackle 2 objectives. The first objective would be allow everybody to share their qualitative impressions of the unspecified approach that was presented on Wednesday. And this is kind of analogous to what we did last Thursday, where PowerX had a more formalized response, but everyone else got to weigh in on the various aspects of the proposal. But before we do that, I want to give a little synopsis or breakdown of how I see the approach and try to fit it in with our scope items. After that, our second objective will be to do some level setting on e-tags and other data that comes out of the ISO market and how it's used for compliance in different types of programs. So I will switch over to this document, which is similar to the one that I had prepared for the resource-specific approach, and just wanted to recap sort of how this unspecified approach works. And then this format should look familiar to you folks because we had used it for the purposes of, this was sort of our scope document. And I'm just going to give a little 10-minute spiel on how it went and then open it back up to the broader audience for their feedback. So I'll start with, this was the unspecified approach, and the core of the proposal was it separated out the area under consideration into a non-greenhouse gas zone and a greenhouse gas zone. So in that way, it's also called like a 2-zone approach. And in order for the non-GHG zone generation to serve load in the GHG zone, it has to overcome a hurdle rate. They also expounded a little bit on some alternative pathways that can be created to allow clean generation to serve the greenhouse gas zone. The hurdle rate, though, is meant to create a price separation between the non-GHG and the greenhouse gas zones, thus, making sure that the market optimizes separately the two different areas. So moving to the scope items here, the first would be the way that the approach was characterized yesterday. The types of costs that are being optimized are greenhouse gas costs. It explicitly said that it does not consider RPS and clean energy standards in the optimization. Moving on to availability, question of whether can supply elect to not serve greenhouse gas zones was indicated sort of as a moot point, right? Because individual resources from the non-GHG zone aren't serving individual loads in the greenhouse gas zones. Rather, there is a separate, method, and it kind of happens at the greenhouse gas zone level instead. And they also expounded on that alternative pathway that I mentioned earlier, and that would be to allow non-emitting resources in the non-GHG zones to opt to serve greenhouse gas zones directly. So in that way, it's kind of an option there. And the details of how that option would work is still kind of TBD. Some ideas that they had put out were that there could be a full opt-in if certain sets of resources wanted to serve the greenhouse gas zone, or if there's some sort of way that clean or non-emitting resources could be verified clean and thus serve the greenhouse gas zone directly somehow. There wasn't much conversation on the frequency of when that election could happen, though the full opt-in would likely have to be less frequently. It probably wouldn't be like an hourly or daily decision. In terms of can demand in greenhouse gas zones, or I suppose elsewhere, elect to not receive greenhouse gas intensive energy, that was also TBD. We didn't really discuss it, so I didn't want to characterize any aspects of the proposal there, or the approach rather. Moving on to the greenhouse gas area here. So I think there's a similarity here between the unspecified approach that was presented and the resource-specific approach that was presented last week, in that it separates out the balancing area transfers from the greenhouse gas zones transfers between non-GHG and greenhouse gas zones. Those areas don't necessarily need to be balancing areas. And I think explicitly they would probably not be. We didn't talk about international considerations, though this might be kind of a moot point. But anyway, moving on to the sort of core issue of the market optimization. Obviously, this is the unspecified attribution approach. We didn't talk a lot about different participation options for different resource types, though some of these might be moot points because, again, we're really talking about starting with the greenhouse gas transfer rather than individual resources serving load. So that's an area that's sort of TBD, but might be not applicable. We didn't talk about whether this greenhouse gas zone approach would require some sort of second optimization. Just a reminder, the resource-specific approach does sort of involve a second optimization through its use of the RUC D+1 run, but we didn't talk about that in the context of the unspecified approach. We also had some participants flag how commitment decisions are made. That is sort of also TBD. We haven't closed that issue out yet. And the question of multiple greenhouse gas zones was also sort of considered to be determined. I think Jeff and Mary mentioned that it might be possible, but that the complexity really increases when we have two different greenhouse gas zones with the potential that those two zones can serve each other. So it just makes the problem a little bit more complicated. So just as the starting point, they started with one greenhouse gas zone and one non-greenhouse gas zone. moving on is how greenhouse gas costs are really like reflected in that optimization. In my mind, there's two. So one is what happens within the greenhouse gas zone and what greenhouse gas price is used in that zone to optimize the dispatch. And then there's some questions around there. Should it be the minimum price, some sort of maximum price? I think there's to be determined there as well. Second would be the greenhouse gas prices and intensity that are used in the calculation of a hurdle rate. So as a reminder, this hurdle rate is sort of an exogenous amount that needs to be cleared in order to allow for transfers from the non-greenhouse gas zone to the greenhouse gas zone. And the intensity of emissions that would be sort of assumed in that calculation also is an open question, whether or not we would use a marginal, like an estimate of the marginal resources, greenhouse gas intensity, or would it be an average intensity of the non-greenhouse gas zone? I think some of those questions are still open as well, which is fine at this point. We're still sort of in the construction phase of both of these approaches, and I'll get to a little bit more on my thoughts on how to proceed in a little bit. But the next was cost reference levels and DEBs and market power mitigation. This is sort of also TBD, consistent with also the resource-specific approach. Moving on to settlements, there was some open questions about how the hurdle rate revenue is distributed within the non-greenhouse gas zone. And we also didn't touch on the topics of rollover to the real-time market or the types of information that could be generated from this market to enable greenhouse gas compliance. So with that really fast approach characterization there, I wanted to, like we did in last week's call, sort of open it up to the broader group to start sharing these qualitative opinions that I kind of suppressed last week, to just make sure that last week's call was meant to, or yesterday's call rather, was meant to really allow Jeff and Mary and other folks who support this approach to characterize and start to fill out some of the details and address specific logistical or technical questions. But I would like today for at least 15, 20 minutes for folks to be able to raise their hand and share their qualitative thoughts. So I'll open it up to sort of a general discussion for those who want to weigh in. I might call on some individual, areas, and if you're not at liberty to speak, that's fine. But again, this is a working group, so we want to make sure that it's really a positive, constructive dialogue about this. And then just as a quick preview of what I want to talk about after this is some homework that I'm hoping that you guys can buy off on taking some homework home. And this will be meant to answer some kind of technical or logistical questions that are still lingering in your head. So anyway, I will open the call up if you want to hop in and raise your support or concerns, or if you have any lingering questions in your head, now's the time to raise those. So the first hand that I saw come up was from Cali Wells. Cali, do you want to go ahead and speak?
Yeah, hi, it's Cali Wells with WPTF. So I've been thinking a lot. I'm not quite sure which key design issue this drops into, probably more of the price formation aspect of it. But I've been thinking a lot more about kind of what the hurdle rate could do to prices. And I know, was it yesterday that we had the call? The days are blurring lately with all the working group meetings. There was discussion about having this hurdle rate set either outside the market, but possibly shaped by some manner. And kind of where my mind was going is, if this hurdle rate, I'm assuming it would have to be made public, and it would have to be set ahead of time. And if that is what the proposal is trying to get at, if there's any sort of, my concern is if there's any sort of predictability with the hurdle rate, because it could create this predictable price separation between the GHG and non-GHG zones, what that might do for virtual bidding opportunities. I mean, in my mind, I went straight to, okay, well, if I could predict that there's going to be a price separation and it's going to be separated by the hurdle rate, and I know what that hurdle rate is, you know, it might, there might be some concern there with virtual bidding that I just kind of was wondering if, I don't know if that's been thought through, or, you know, what your initial reaction is to that. And if that is a concern, if there was any thought given to making the hurdle rate a little bit more dynamic, meaning that it's not something as predictable as an hourly shape, or you know, the extreme case would be the same hurdle rate every hour, every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to answer for Jeff and Mary, and I also don't want to put them back on the spot without giving them full warning, but I did have some similar thoughts myself. I think the basic approach, as I understand it, would be a fixed hurdle rate, but there was some conversations about that shaping on an hourly basis. And I think this conversation will be informed also as to whether or not the hurdle rate is based on like a marginal resource or meant to reflect the average emissions intensity of the area. So if it's the marginal resource, it would probably be a little bit less dynamic. If we were recalculating the average emission rate, could be a little bit more dynamic, but I don't have an answer for that. I do see that Mary had raised her hand, just for the sake of addressing Callie's question. Mary, would you feel comfortable responding?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I was going to say, and I don't know if Jeff is on, he might have comments on this too, but I do think the thinking is that that hurdle rate could be dynamic. And I think there's probably a number of different ways to do it. I think the key element that we wanted to flag was just that we don't think that the hurdle rate can be an output of the optimization. It has to be something that, you know, is an input. And so, but I think there could probably be a number of different ways of calculating it and identifying it. And hopefully that would mitigate some of the concerns that you're raising, but that would certainly be something I think we need to think through.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, I was thinking kind of where my mind went when I, you know, thought about the virtual bidding concern is if we do go down a path of a hurdle rate and further explore it, I think we would definitely want to look at making it as, I don't want to say as dynamic as possible, but something that would mitigate the predictability of it. I understand it needs to be an input, so I'm just kind of thinking off the cuff of my, you know, sleeve here is that sounds to me maybe like a two-pass approach almost, where you base the hurdle rate based on another market run or something to that effect. But I think it's worth thinking through how dynamic we could make the hurdle rate if that's the path that this goes down. But I appreciate that response. Thanks.
Jeff, did you have anything to add there? Jeff Spires.
Thanks, Kevin. Jeff Spires with PowerX. I think Mary's response probably covered it for the most part, but you know, I think the most simple solution as a sort of starting assumption would be that you have some kind of fixed GHG intensity that you're assuming, which is much like the unspecified rate that's used in the context of the California cap and trade program today. It's a defined number. It's something that people know what that rate is. I think the concept around would it change maybe hour to hour or would it evolve more dynamically in some other fashion was really intended to say, you know, could there be ways to improve upon the accuracy of an assumption about the likely emissions rate of the resources outside of the zone that are being used to import into the zone. And so the example I gave the other day was one where perhaps in the middle of the day when there is a solar production, surplus solar production, both within the zone but also outside of it, at that stage, is there a lower GHG assumption that would be more reflective of the operating conditions at that time, as opposed to, say, the net load peak hours in which it's much more likely that gas resources are on the margin and that it would be gas resources that are being used to support imports into the zone. But from the perspective of virtual bidding, I think those types of issues are definitely worth considering, and I wouldn't want to say go too far without having thought through all of the details. But I think initially my reaction is that those are not conflicting. The idea of a virtual bid and having a GHG rate, mainly because the outcome that I think we're expecting to see through this type of solution is that the marginal price within the zone reflects both the energy cost and the marginal GHG emissions rate, whereas the price outside of the zone is reflecting the marginal energy cost for meeting load without the GHG cost. And so those are sort of defined assumptions, and if you're submitting a virtual bid either in the zone or outside of it, you are doing that to help converge those prices in those two areas. And so I don't think that necessarily is a challenge, but it is worth considering in more detail.
Yeah, great. So on the topic of the unspecified rate being used, or sort of the calculation of the hurdle rate, I saw that Ram Verma had raised his hand. I think you might have a question related to this. So Ram, do you want to go ahead? And please identify yourself first for the group.
Good afternoon. This is Ram Verma from California Department of Water Resources. My only clarification I want on the unspecified rate. A lower hurdle rate can be unfair to the fossil fuel resources in California, because right now cap and trade, the rate of emission rate for cap and trade for unspecified sources is 0.428 metric ton per megawatt hour. If that is used, then simple cycle sources in California might have disadvantage, because a higher emission rate source, for example, a qualified plant with over 1 metric ton of emission per megawatt hour can be dispatched before dispatching a lower emission rate resources from California.
Yeah. So if I understand your question or your point correctly, is that if there's a generator in California, say it's a simple cycle gas turbine, it would appear more expensive than even a higher emission resource outside of the greenhouse gas zone, because, say it's a coal resource as you used, the emissions rate in actuality might be much higher than the unspecified rate. But when it's being imported into California, it appears, quote unquote, to the market as only being that much lower unspecified rate. And so that might create some disadvantages for resources in the greenhouse gas zone compared to those outside of the greenhouse gas zone. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering if anybody else from the California community has any thoughts on that, and maybe looking forward, if Washington were to join, do any of the utilities in that area share a similar concern that you might be similarly disadvantaged? So does anyone else have any thoughts on that? Or maybe I can turn it. I saw that Alva, I see your hand is raised. Do you want to respond to this point, or is your hand raised for a different topic?
It's somewhat related. There's just a couple of sort of similar concerns. One, and I think these are not insurmountable, but it would seem to me that this is basically a demand side cost, and so it's difficult for demand within a greenhouse gas zone such as California to be able to incent clean generation to come into California. Basically, the effect of this hurdle rate is going to be to assuming that clean energy has a very low marginal cost, it's going to be used to serve load outside of California preferentially, and only when load is needed in California is it going to come from outside. This is just kind of, to me, would be one of the potential optics of this approach, is that there's no way to drive clean energy outside of California to come into California. And a similar issue comes up with, and sort of similar to what Ram was raising, is thinking about batteries, where it's certainly the case that batteries outside of California would be able to charge not using a hurdle rate and then sell potentially into California with a hurdle rate, which essentially adds to the arbitrage that they could get out of the market compared to a battery within California. So those would be a couple of similar concerns that I would raise.
Yeah, so I think we'll get to your first point shortly. The second point on storage resources was something that I was thinking about as well, and I hear where you're coming from, that similar to lower emission simple cycle resources in the greenhouse gas zone being disadvantaged compared to similar resources outside, or even higher emitting resources outside, due to the unspecified rate, or whichever rate we use for the calculation of the hurdle rate, whichever emissions rate we use, is that energy storage resources might also be disadvantaged in the greenhouse gas zone compared to those without.
That's right.
Because they could charge at a lower cost and then import into California. So that's interesting. I need to think that over a little bit. I saw that Mary and Jeff have their hands raised. Mary, you had your hand up first, so just first to the buzzer wins in this case. Do you want to respond to Ram and Alva's points about the simple cycle and perhaps the battery resources as well? If you wouldn't mind unmuting Mary Winky, operator, please.
Great, thanks. So yeah, a couple of reactions, and I'm sure Jeff will articulate this as well. So I think the way to think about it is a little bit differently than kind of the current paradigm, in the sense that you are creating incentives for renewable energy to be in the zone. And so you are creating incentives for renewable energy to serve load inside the zone by being in the zone, not by differentiating transfers between the zones. So I think you are incentivizing what the program should incentivize, and not disadvantaging storage or solar or whatever that's outside of California. I think the key piece is that resources that are outside of the physical boundaries of California and Washington can, again, have criteria for sort of getting around that hurdle and actually being in the zone. So that's the way that you incentivize basically renewables to serve load inside the zone, rather than attempting to differentiate the hurdle rate. The other thing I wanted to say, I think this is in response to Ram's comment. I do think that's why we will need to look at, I think, different scenarios of what that hurdle rate is, and you you want to avoid a situation where you're shifting generation, both from a market and leakage perspective, where you're shifting generation from fossil resources inside the zone to higher emitting resources outside the zone. That's kind of your natural, market outcome. I think that's the point of the hurdle rate is to mitigate that. And I think we can just think about how we set it so that it's mitigated as much as possible. And, as Jeff and I both repeated yesterday quite a bit, you're hoping that on average that hurdle rate is, mitigating that shift, but it's not going to be perfect. And I think that's something that we need to recognize. But I don't know that there is a more perfect, there's no perfect solution, I think, when it comes to that, that phenomenon. So I'll let Jeff weigh in too there.
Yeah, that's a great response. And on your first answer, let's say that question of kind of the carve-outs just for the time being, and keep it on the second answer, which I thought you answered really eloquently. So I'm not going to try to recharacterize it, but I will give Jeff another chance to weigh in here. And then sort of a novel point that was introduced by Alva was the energy storage question. So if you have any thoughts on that, Jeff, it might be useful to hear your thoughts. And sorry that I'm putting Jeff and Mary on the spot here. I think we as a working group will be moving to help address these questions. So I don't want to make it feel like you two are on the spot to have all the answers for everything, because the working group itself is meant to be the mechanism through which we make these decisions. But I'm just allowing folks to raise these thoughts, and then we definitely will, as a working group, start to try to tackle these questions on a more granular basis. But we appreciate your input in today's call, just as sort of a starting point. So, Jeff, did you want to weigh in response to Ram and Alva?
Yes, thanks, Kevin, and I appreciate your comments there. But I'm happy to participate and try to clarify at least some of the thinking, but certainly we don't have all the answers, and there are issues that we need to consider in more detail. But just to that, I think the concern that Ram and Alva both raised are different variations of that same question, which is, if you, in the instance of not properly accounting for the GHG costs of resources outside of the zone, you run the risk that internal resources are disadvantaged. And I think, Kevin, you described that well, where even if you had two resources that were very similar, you could find a situation where the external resource ends up getting dispatched ahead of a resource within the zone because the hurdle rate is too low, or because its GHG costs are not considered fully the way that they are within the zone. And I just wanted to emphasize that is really one of the objectives of this proposal in the first place, is to design an effective hurdle rate that is preventing against that outcome in a way that is achievable. Because what I would say is that outcome is one of the challenges that we see with the EIM algorithm. And the reason for that is, kind of using Ram's example, you can have a simple cycle gas plant inside California that's accountable for its GHG costs fully, competing against a resource outside of California that is being dispatched in the EIM, but that dispatch is being combined with the deeming algorithm that's selecting a hydro resource that was already running. And so what can happen in that situation is the costs of the simple cycle resource outside of the zone are not including GHG, because the algorithm is able to dispatch that simple cycle resource and then deem some other resource that was already running, and that the combined effect of those two choices is lower cost than the internal resource. So that's actually one of the outcomes that we're attempting to avoid by getting the hurdle rate to be reasonably reflective of the type of resources that are likely to be dispatched outside of the GHG zone and be used to import into the zone. I think recognizing, of course, that a hurdle rate is making an assumption, it is not going to be perfectly accurate. The actual resources that are dispatched in any given period might have a higher or lower emissions profile than that assumption that you're making, but the objective is that that assumption is reasonable and realistic and prevents those outcomes from occurring on a systematic basis.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's great. So Ram, Alva, I don't know if you have any reactions to that. If not, that's fine. I'll give you a chance to raise your hands, and if anybody from if anybody from an area that might be a future GHG zone has similar concerns, feel free to raise those too. I think it sounds like one of the key tasks in continuing down this approach is what an effective hurdle rate really is. Like, how would you characterize what are the attributes of an effective hurdle rate, and then sort of how do we get there? Are questions that we'll want to do if we really want to nail this approach. So Alva, I see you re-raised your hand. Do you want to respond back, and then maybe we can move on to the next topic?
Yeah, and it's not to debate. It's actually just to say that I think there's a good point in what Jeff and Mary are stating, which is I think if you get into more of the nuances of these problems that we've raised, they're present in both approaches. And there are ways to strategically allocate, as Jeff has pointed out very well, that could be equally harmful to objectives that California might have. So I think some of these concerns are going to have to be dealt with in either case, and which is the better approach, I think we'll find out as we go further on. So I just want to say it's not necessarily damning of the hurdle rate approach to raise these kinds of issues, because they may occur in the other one as well.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, guys. That was a really good discussion, and I think there's more to be had there. I'm seeing some chat that this might be a little bit hard to read, so I'm trying to increase the size here. That's the best I can do. I'll move on. I saw that Claire had her hand raised. Claire, do you want to go ahead and speak? And introduce yourself first, too, please.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. This is Claire Brighton, also with WPTF. I just wanted to throw in a couple other things that haven't been reflected yet in the conversation. And let me just caveat it by saying that to the extent that WPTF is thinking about a hurdle rate or thinking through the implications, we're thinking of a model that would allow other opportunities to get around the hurdle. So not solely bringing your entire system. That said, I think I agree with Jeff's point about to get the price right, we need to get to the emission rate of marginal generation. But I wanted to point out that we don't really need to get to the marginal generation of resources outside, or at least we currently don't have to, outside the greenhouse gas zone. Both the two states that have adopted cap and trade have eliminated coal from their supply. There's not going to be coal resources that are subject to the cap and trade programs in those states. Therefore, it doesn't seem to me that the emission rate used in setting the hurdle needs to go as high as the emission rate of external coal. What we need to do is ensure that the emission, if there is a hurdle, that it's set at a level that's sufficient to displace effectively gas generation within the greenhouse gas zones to gas generation outside. So, there may be a distinction between looking at what's marginal in the greenhouse gas zone versus what's marginal outside. The other thing I just want to point out is that if we move to a marginal rate, we are, by definition, effectively going to overestimate the emissions associated with the transfer into the greenhouse gas zone, because a lot of those transfers will have been supported by inframarginal units. I don't think that's necessarily a problem in and of itself, but I know we've got some CARB staff on the call. Just like right now, the transfers into the EIM have underestimated emissions, and the California Air Resource Board had to do an adjustment to effectively claw allowances back to account for those emissions. If we go down the marginal rate, we're creating the problem in the opposite direction, in that we will overestimate emissions associated with transfers, and maybe there'll be a need to make an administrative adjustment on the other side. So I'll just stop there. I just wanted to flag those two other issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. The getting around the hurdle rate question is definitely one that I want to return to today. But it sounds like, from what I understand, so if we have kind of a supply and demand curve, the inframarginal resources in terms of emissions will be attributed to serving the greenhouse gas zone at a higher emissions rate than maybe they actually are, right? So if you have, say, a gas burning resource and, well, let's say it's some sort of more efficient gas burning resource compared to the one that's at the margin, which is a higher emitting gas resource, then that less emitting resource would be attributed with the higher emissions rate, thereby overestimating the emissions to deliver to the zone. Is that what you're saying? Did I butcher that?
I would put it a little bit differently, because we're not
Okay,
talking
yeah.
about resource specific deeming in this case for the hurdle. We're talking about a volume of energy and then an emission rate assigned to that volume of energy. And the true emission rate of that volume of energy is going to be the average of all emissions in the market at that point in time. The marginal emission rate will be the emission rate, the high end of that emission rate. So the volume, by using a marginal, we'd be overstating the true emissions associated with the transfer into the GHG zone. And again, just to emphasize, I don't think that's necessarily a deal breaker. I'm just pointing it out.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, it sounds like, I think we'll get to this a little bit later, is, the information that the market has currently is power related, it's megawatts. So it sounds like, though, then the regulation might be affected on how emissions are attributed to that power, right? Because the output of the market currently would just be, here's how many megawatts went from the non-greenhouse gas zone to the greenhouse gas zone. But the sort of after the fact, hey, what was the emissions intensity of those megawatts, would be something that either the market would have to figure out or the regulators within the greenhouse gas zone. So yeah, that's a good point to raise. I see Kathleen has her hand raised, and I want to give Kathleen a chance to speak, and then I do want to, just considering the time, give folks a chance to raise their thoughts on this sort of alternative approach to serve greenhouse gas zones, which wouldn't be subject to the hurdle rate. So if you have any thoughts on that, start stewing on those, and please raise your hand. But I'll turn the floor over to Kathleen. Kathleen, would you please go ahead?
Thanks, Kathleen Colbert from District. Actually, Kevin, do you mind repeating what your question was? Because it might have been related. Can you say it one more time?
Yeah, so there was, the default assumption is that for a non-greenhouse gas zone to serve a greenhouse gas zone, the price separation would need to be high enough to overcome this exogenous hurdle rate. But that some alternative mechanisms to allow greenhouse gas, or clean resources, non-emitting resources from the non-greenhouse gas zone to serve the greenhouse gas zone were proposed, but weren't fully characterized. A couple of options were raised that certain portfolios could be fully opted in, or that there was some sort of verifiable clean output option. And so I wanted to give folks a chance to raise their thoughts about that alternative mechanism. This could be a brainstorm of other ideas here, or just sort of qualitative assessment. Hey, that's a great idea. I want my clean resources to be able to serve the greenhouse gas zone. Or, hey, this seems a little, I don't know, if I feel like we need to characterize it more. Those could be reactions to this. So, go ahead, Kathy.
Sure. Okay. No, thanks for repeating. This is Kathleen Goldberg from Vistra. I do think what I wanted to say is related, so I wanted to double check. And I also wanted to kind of respond. I think you asked a big picture qualitative question in the beginning about whether or not we think that this addresses some of the design principles and objectives as well. So maybe I'll take that one and then take the second one. So I'll start with, I think that this alternative merits us looking into it further and working on these details. So I commend the CAISO and commend you for going through this and breaking these elements out and giving us a chance to talk about it. I hope we can continue to do so. In my mind, the next step is really working through more examples and scenarios and maybe some simulations, because I feel the more that we talk about these items and I think about them, I'm almost starting from a place of I have an idea of how the dispatch solution should work and what the transfer, how we want the dispatch solution to work. So kind of that feeds into the details of what a hurdle rate should look like, how it would function in the market. And when we're thinking through what do we want that solution to look like, it's really tied to my environmental policy peers inside my company's views on how environmental policy is supposed to be functioning. And so I just wanted to throw it out there that for us, I think we're going to try and do some thinking through the examples and scenarios. Maybe we could do some in this working group, put together like a spreadsheet or something that we could all monkey with would be great. But I think that there's something elegant about this idea to us of having the unspecified approach, because we're really thinking about this as the market dispatch should be able to incentivize the right dispatch outcome that is consistent with the regulations. And we see this being better able to inform that than perhaps the resource specific, more after the fact approach. And I know we have to work through details, but I just want to give some qualitative feedback. I think that maybe this could be better aligned to the regulations and how it kind of works. On the specific of, with that in mind, the regulations allow for loads to contract with external resources to meet their obligations and to help them achieve these goals. And so the rules are applied on imports, but there should be a recognition that contracting is allowed and can occur. I'm very comfortable with the way that we talked through it yesterday of potentially, let's say, having a new master file flag that identifies covered entities, and maybe each resource could register if it's covered under a given program so that we could model it within the greenhouse gas compliance area, even if it's technically external. And I'm comfortable with that because the master file team can confirm there's a contract associated with that delivery and other requirements, transmission, whatever it is we define as rules to be eligible to register like that. I'd be very comfortable with it being something that master file could validate, and then giving them the ability to kind of quote unquote get around the hurdle. But I almost don't see it as get around the hurdle, right? I see it as we set up clear definition of what's included and covered under a program, which can include external contract resources. And then we just, under this approach, could model them within the area, which is, I think, what I see as the elegance. So I think that was responsive to your question, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, that was great. And I thought it was a great response. And I really like the idea of examples and scenarios. And you had me at spreadsheet as a former accountant. I'm all in on spreadsheets. So let's put that on. I'll put that on my mental list and start trying to put together examples of both the resource specific and unspecified approaches. and pencil out sort of how this would work in different scenarios. The point about the recognition that loads contract with external generation, and that should just be recognized in this approach, I think does sound like one of the criteria or methodologies that would enable transfers between zones without needing to clear the hurdle rate. So maybe my hurdle rate carve out is a little unfair, and I think it's an interesting reframing of the idea away from there's a hurdle rate and there's different ways to get around it to, hey, there are these existing pathways that already exist, and then for everybody else there's a hurdle rate. I think that's an interesting way to reframe the point. So I'll give Jeff a chance to respond. Claire, I see, never mind, you just got a note. So Jeff, do you want to go ahead? And then I see Alyssa with her hand raised.
Thanks, Kevin. Jeff Spires with PowerX. I just wanted to emphasize what you raised earlier, and I think it's consistent with the discussion with Kathleen, but you raised the question of what are the avenues to enable clean resources to access the GHG zone and to get the benefit of that clean supply if they're external to the GHG jurisdiction. And I just wanted to emphasize that I think our discussion yesterday and today tends to focus on the sort of underlying framework, which is you've got this unspecified hurdle rate in the market, because that's kind of the basic setup for the concept. But I really wanted to make the point that finding those pathways to enabling clean resources is really a critical element of this design. I mean, from PowerX's point of view, for example, we have clean surplus energy that we want to be able to get the value of through the market and be able to transact that clean surplus hydro capability and have that recognized through the market. And so we are absolutely motivated to find appropriate mechanisms to allow for clean supply to participate, but doing that in a way that is still consistent with the other objectives, including minimizing leakage and some of the other unintended consequences that we've raised concerns about. So we don't have necessarily all the answers to what those pathways might be, but I just don't want to lose sight of that because it really is a very important part of this overall concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. So Alyssa, I see that you have your hand raised. Would you mind going ahead?
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm just going to end up really adding to what Jeff said there in that.
Just say you're affiliated with, just so.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Alyssa Caseweeder, Bonneville Power Administration. And I'm going to add to what Jeff said and just saying that I think that there's room under the sort of vision and of this particular design to enable a pathway for clean resources that aren't in that GHG zone to use more of a specified emissions factor with some accounting principles where they can actually show that there really is surplus power from those clean resources. And I'm, specifically thinking of the Pacific Northwest and hydro here, should that not be located in that GHG zone. I also think that from Bonneville's perspective, we wouldn't just want it to be zero energy clean resources, because we do sell from a system that is has a very low emissions factor. And so I don't think that saying that low emissions factor, in the same way that clean resources can be identified as serving load in that GHG zone, that low emissions factor power can be as well. I don't think that that's inconsistent. And I do think that we can come up with a way to do that accounting in a manner that shows that there really is surplus hydro, surplus solar, whatever clean resource we're talking about, that would meet the sort of needs, hopefully, of what the regulators are looking for in terms of assurance that there's not an actual leakage or secondary dispatch issue there. So thank you.
Yeah, great, cool. Thanks, Alyssa. So I don't have any other hands raised currently. I do see actually, sorry, some other hands popping up, but I haven't heard much from other than Alva, some of the California utilities and folks from the Desert Southwest. I definitely appreciate your thoughts on this because I know that there's lots of abundant solar out there, and you know, I think this conversation here that we're having is relevant for that as well, and you know, nukes and that sort of thing as well. So just, you know, if you're in a position to respond back or raise your hand, we'd love to hear your thoughts. And if not, I understand. But Dan Williams, would you mind going ahead?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. This is Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Just kind of a general comment here from, you know, sitting in all these different work groups that I feel like from a you know, program management or an overall design management perspective that we may soon start reaching these points within the working groups where we need to have direct conversations across them. And just thinking about some of the things that are being developed within the resource sufficiency working group, things around operational plans, different ways of assessing how entities are setting up for the next day, and in the transmission working group as well. It's a very interesting discussion this morning that some of those may offer opportunities to start to identify things like the you know, marginal unspecified rate that is likely to be there in the market given how people are setting up their resource plans, or different ways of connecting the resource in the GHG zone to the non-GHG zone load, and those sorts of things that you know, we just may need some big tent participation at some point, even though a lot of us are in all the meetings, not everyone's in every meeting.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let us take that back internally, and you know, we've got it's not just us in silos. We do have meetings between the different working group coordinators, and I think this would be a good conversation to have and start thinking through. Yeah, I haven't been able to follow all of those working groups, but it sounds like the issue that you raised from the RSC working group would be the idea of resource plans and how that might inform the portfolio that's available to serve the greenhouse gas zone. And then from the transmission working group, that's sort of the type of thing that Cali was raising, recognition that there are these contracts that exist, and you know, it would allow these behind the, well, the, yeah, okay, you know, yeah, we will
just identifying some of the things that if you know, working group one is kind of looking at path A, B, and C, maybe path C helps support what's going on here, or give some new ideas around how to think about how much of the resource fleet is going to be self-scheduled and how much is going to be sort of transacted prior to the market, that may set some things in place around GHG accounting in a different way, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
I'm seeing some messages. Milos or Phil, do you want to raise your hand and speak to this point? Because I think it's a good one and something that you might be able to help with. See, Milos has hand raised. Yep, Milos, go ahead.
Good afternoon. This is Milos for the California. So I just wanted to again echo what Kevin noted, but great suggestion, Dan. And we're actually working on a monthly kind of debrief meeting across the working group stakeholder meeting, where we can tease out some of these interdependencies and interconnections, take stock of where we are in the working groups, kind of provide a roadmap of where we're going, where we've been, but also, like I said, talk a little bit about some of those interdependencies between topics across all three of the working groups, and have an opportunity to discuss those further. So be on the lookout. There should be a market notice later this week, likely tomorrow, announcing some of these monthly debrief meetings across working groups that will provide for some of that coordination, but also allow stakeholders that maybe are not able to participate across all three of the working groups to get a better sense of what's going on across all three of them. So we should be announcing that for mid-February and then one towards the mid-March or so.
Great. Thank you, Milosh. It's good to have people thinking about the broader picture. I've just been so buried in the greenhouse gas world. It's a good being buried, but I appreciate you guys raising those points. So I'll give one last call on sort of qualitative impressions of folks to raise on this unspecified approach. And if there aren't any additional thoughts, I can move on to the next segment of our discussion today. So last chance. All right, I'm not seeing any other hand raised, so I will move on. So,
Kevin, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a chat question from Todd Jones. I'm not sure if you see it, to all panelists.
Yeah, thank you. All right. So Todd, yes, okay. So Todd asks, will you be evaluating this approach against the design objectives similar to how we did for the resource-specific approach? And thanks, it's a good question. So I think when we started to do that in the last working group last Thursday, it was kind of hard to tease out the questions of, hey, how would this work? From, hey, here's how I think this does to achieve the design objective. So this is a good transition into this homework assignment that I want to propose here, which is meant to help us really focus on the questions that are still open in our minds of a technical or logistical nature. So an example of that would be, how is the hurdle rate calculated? Thinking about the resource-specific approach, what do we use as the baseline for the calculation of emissions that can be attributed or generation that can be attributed to the load instead of using the base schedule. So, having those questions answered will allow us to do a more comprehensive evaluation against those design objectives rather than trying to do it sort of partially, which I think was kind of where we wound up in last week's call. It was sort of hard to tease out the overall impressions of how well it meets the design objective from the questions that are more logistical in nature. So thanks, Todd, for raising that. Sorry, switch back to my video. I hope that answers your question. So next, I kind of have to be the bad teacher and assign some homework or ask that you folks take some time away from the working group meetings to choose some of the topics that we've been discussing over today. And the idea here is for folks to go back into their organization and chew over and try to come up with a list of the top 3 questions they would want to have answered such that you could do that evaluation effectively, the one that Todd was mentioning earlier. So what I'd like to do is, the next few meetings won't be directly on this market optimization approach, but they will definitely discuss elements of it. So I don't want to characterize them as being off to the side, but we won't be explicitly discussing the merits of the unspecified or resource-specific approaches. So take the next week and a half and come up with a list of 3 questions that you might have. And what I've done is I've created a Word document, which I'll post, I think, tomorrow, of sort of the parameters of this discussion and some examples that I had here. And the hope is that you could take this, fill it out, and come back to the working group with these questions. So this is really meant to give folks a chance to put yourselves in the shoes of what the ISO policy team does. So we've got a couple approaches on the table. There's still some open questions. What do we do now? And this is when we really do some of the hard thinking of I'm not an ISO policy developer, but this is the point at which they typically will kind of start to identify areas that need further development, and so that we can start answering them, and then that will enable the conversation around, does this meet the design objective? Does this approach do it better than the other one? Those types of things. So I'm going to post this onto the ISO website, and then we'll come back on February 8th, which is not the coming Tuesday, but the one after that, and start to try to compile a list of the open questions that we have. And after that, I think on the February 10th meeting, we can think about revising the scope and really trying to focus exactly on the open questions that we have, which I think we started to identify in today's meeting and did so also in last week's meetings. So that's my general thought. Does anyone have any comments, concerns, questions? Hey, Kevin, these working groups are already enough effort as is. This is unfair. If you want to yell at me, that's fine. That's my job. So does anyone have any oppositions to this, or just kind of technical questions about how this might work? Okay, I'm not seeing any, but if you do, feel free to raise them through the call. This document will be posted on the ISO working group webpage, and just take a read through it. I've put in a couple of example questions that, frankly, I had when considering the two different approaches. If we have another approach that's posed, we probably want to do the same exercise. And then I've also put in these summaries of the different approaches that might be helpful in the discussions that you're having internally. So I see Jessica has her hand raised. Jessica, do you have a question?
Hi there, Kevin. Yeah, Jessica Zano, Pacific Core. Thank you. I know this is probably unrealistic, but I have to ask. If you don't ask, you don't know. Is it possible to get the due date shifted to the 10th? We have multiple rulemakings kind of coming to a head on the 8th and 9th in Washington, and that would be really helpful if we could just have a couple more days to look at this.
Yeah, let me think about it, and I will, either update this document if we make a decision this week on that, or talk about it on Tuesday. But I think that's a valuable point, and I think I know the rulemakings that you're talking about. It seems like a fair amount of work on that aspect too. So,
awesome. Anybody appreciate that?
Yeah, thanks. And if anybody else would advocate for the February 10th date, please feel free to raise your hands now. So anyway, so I'll move on to the second half, and if folks have questions on this, we can always come back to that. I see Kathleen also has your hand up. Kathleen?
I just wanted to throw support in behind Jessica. There's other stuff going on next week. Deadline's on Friday, so it'll give us more time to put something together for the 10th.
Cool. Thanks, Kathleen. All right. So I will move on to the second half of the presentation. So the next few weeks, we are going to be discussing some reporting related topics, and I wanted to do a little bit of level setting here just so folks who aren't as entrenched in this as others might have like a good starting point to consider the points that are being raised. And just to add some more context to that, on Tuesday, we're going to have Kathy Taylor from the Washington Department of Ecology come and speak about the cap and trade program. And that program is still in the rulemaking process, so she might not be able to answer all of our questions, but we thought it'd be a good idea to still give her a chance to present some overall summary of the program, and to the extent that she can answer some of our questions, this would be the opportunity to ask them. And the latter half of Tuesday's presentation will be from Commissioner Ann Rendall from the Washington UTC, the sort of Public Utility Commission in Washington. She's going to talk about the Clean Energy Transformation Act, I believe is what it's called, and some of the issues that she sees out on the horizon for compliance with different RPS and clean energy programs in Washington. And then on Thursday, Dr. Vijay Satyal will come from Western Resource Advocates and talk a little bit about a generation track and certificate program. And that's has elements of reporting, and it might also inform some of the discussions that we have around the market optimization. So we're looking forward to all of those presentations, but I do want to make sure that everyone's kind of working from a common shared understanding. So with that, I'll move to the next slide. So the CAISO markets generate, no, it's okay. The core things that come out of the ISO's market are market awards of megawatt and prices, right? As we've discussed multiple times before, for non-California EIM entities, the market also awards megawatts for electricity that's being delivered to California. So that's that separate calculation in the EIM currently. That's sort of the basis of the resource-specific approach. So those are the key things that come out of the ISO's market. We do have some information posted on the ISO website about greenhouse gas intensity, which is really interesting, and there's a bunch of really cool information that you can see there, so I encourage folks to check it out. This information is, however, informational in nature. To my knowledge, it's not used for complying with any state's compliance programs, but still very valuable and interesting. If you have some time, I would encourage you to check it out. Moving on, one of the key instruments that is used for complying with clean energy standards, RPS programs, et cetera, is the ETAG. And so the North American Electric Reliability Council has this concept, this mechanism called an ETAG, which reports the source of an energy and the load that's ultimately served. That source can even be like a generating resource that's serving a load, right? And it's used to track, at least on paper, the flow of energy between these two, the source and the sink of this energy. And that's very useful in these programs. In most cases, the ISO doesn't create ETAGs. Like, we wouldn't create an ETAG for a transaction between a generating resource and a load that's being served. Instead, scheduling coordinators and purchasing selling entities in our market submit them to the ISO, and we factor them into the optimization. And I would encourage folks to check out this ISO operating procedure, which has some more information about the roles and responsibilities of different entities within this tagging process. Frankly, I'm relatively new to this area, so if I've made any mistakes here, they are my own, and I encourage folks to raise any concerns with how I've characterized this or propose any edits. I'm not saying I got this perfectly, but this is to the best of my knowledge. So I wanted to characterize some of the different types of transactions and whether a generating resource specific ETAG would be created, right? And just as a reminder, this ETAG might be useful, say, if a clean energy resource serves a particular load that could be used in the compliance of a renewable portfolio standard, right? So just going one by one, if a generator within the ISO serves California load, it doesn't create a generating resource specific ETAG because it's within the balancing area. However, if that same generation serves an external balancing area, not through the EIM, then they would create a generating resource specific tag if it's from a specific generator. The important thing to note, though, is if that is an EIM transaction, which is what this third one here is, that a generator resource specific tag isn't created. Instead, we have this concept of an ETSR, which I think is energy transfer system resource, and that sort of creates the tag, but it's at the balancing area rather than at the generator specific level. So in this case, that's why we have a separate mechanism for tracking transactions through the EIM. Conversely, if there's an external balancing area that's serving California load, it is possible for a generating resource specific tag to be created and used, right? So this is what's used in allowing for California load to comply with California's RPS programs, which we'll get to more. There's some other caveats there. However, similar to this, sorry, I had this one backwards. So if California is exporting to an external BAA outside of California, there is, it goes through the ETSR. Conversely, if an external EIM balancing area is serving California load, similar to this, there's not a generating resource specific tag. It's the balancing area that is responsible for creating the tag. And, just two other ones, external BAs serving EIM BAs, and conversely, as long as it's contracted and documented, there can be a generating resource specific tag. So if I butchered anything, I apologize, but I wanted to give a little bit of background into this. Does anyone have any thoughts or concerns? I haven't seen any hands raised, so I'm going to assume everything I said was right, and if I got anything wrong, I apologize. Moving on, as I mentioned, these tags are really meant. One of their key uses is complying with different states' programs, right? So, as we've discussed in the past, CARB has a cap and trade program, and in order to comply with that cap and trade program, specifically the mandatory reporting requirements, electricity imports need to be tracked because those are covered under CARB's programs. Those imports can take several different forms. If they're as specified import, I think is how they refer to it. If there's an import from an external balancing area into the California balancing area or into California, and it has a specified resource contract in place, then CARB can use its ETAG data or meter data, I think ETAG and meter data, to confirm that import into California. If there isn't a contract in place, then unspecified imports apply here, and these also use ETAG data. We've talked about this in the past as well. So there's electricity imports via bilateral transactions, and then there's electricity imports via the energy imbalance market, the CAISO's energy imbalance market. In this case, tag data is not used, right? Because, as I mentioned on the last slide, the tags aren't generating resource specific, rather they're at the balancing area level. So instead, the EIM's algorithm does this attribution, and this is the source of a lot of the conversations that we've been having. The CARB also has a calculation of EIM outstanding emissions, which uses megawatt hour data that's reported to them by us from our market, right? So, and then the third option here is in-state generation, and that uses alternative tracking mechanisms. So you can see that really a substantial amount of the transactions are either traced through ETAGs or alternative mechanisms, while the EIM-related transactions are traced through megawatt-hour data created from our market. The next step would be talking about other states. I didn't want to be fully California-centric. That's really, to the best of my, that's what I know the best. So if I've mischaracterized any other states, I encourage folks who are more familiar with these programs to weigh in. Washington is in the process, as we've mentioned, of building their cap and trade, cap and invest program. To my knowledge, there's no CAISO market currently used for compliance, but hopefully we'll talk a little bit about this next week, whether or not EIM data will be used in the compliance of Washington. But currently, as of January 27th, 2022, there's no data that's currently used for compliance. And then as far as I know, other states and provinces in WEC do not use our market data for compliance. This is to broadly characterize that there's only a subset of electricity transactions that rely on CAISO market output to ensure compliance with their programs. Moving on, similarly to the greenhouse gas compliance programs, there's RPS and clean energy standards. California's RPS program relies on ETAG data, but there are kind of a carve out here of certain types of transfers that we call dynamic transfers that require execution of certain ISO contracts and also use meter and ETAG data. And as far as I know, there's no direct reliance on ISO market data to ensure compliance with other states' RPS programs. So does anyone have any reactions to what I said? And if I mischaracterize anything, I'd love to make sure that this presentation is accurate when we have it on the website. So if I missed anything, feel free to raise your hand and correct me, because it wouldn't surprise me if I did. So does anyone have any thoughts, questions, concerns? All right. So I'm not hearing any. So I hope this provides folks a good basis to go into next week's conversations. I think that next week will be a really good deeper dive into how Washington's program works and some alternative types of reporting that could come out of the ISO's market or some other external entity. So I will return back to the schedule that I have. Well, I think we've already kind of characterized the schedule. So February 1st meeting will be from two different Washington state representatives, somebody from the Department of Ecology and then somebody from the Washington UTC. And then Thursday will be from Western Resource Advocates, and we'll hear a little bit more about a potential generation tracking system. So I think we've kind of reached the end of the agenda. I hope you folks think that we've achieved at least our two objectives for today's meeting, which was to share some qualitative impressions of the unspecified approach and level set on how ETAGs work and other data being reported out of our markets. And I'd encourage folks, once this document is posted for the homework, to please review it and spend, an hour or so internal to your organization, starting to chew over these questions, identifying open areas of your understanding that might be good fodder for our working group. So at this point, I don't have anything else. I would like to turn it over to Brian Jacobson to do a little summary, and then we might be able to close out a little bit early today. Brian, would you please go ahead?
Thank you, Kevin. A little bit briefer notes today than the past meetings. So Kevin did give his best to overlay the summary of discussions in the last couple of meetings on the unspecified approach within the scoping document. We also have the red lines that he had created, and then offered discussion around those red lines. And then later he noted that red-lined scoping document is embedded into the homework assignment, so you can all see that. I think it's going to be posted later today or tomorrow. But the discussion around that really centered around the importance of the hurdle rate and the implications of if the hurdle rate is not, the ways the inappropriate hurdle rate could impact the outcomes, particularly about green low emitting resources being able to compete within the greenhouse gas region. One potential solution offered there, one way of mitigating that was offered that that could be contracted and then self-scheduled. We would need some master file constructs to model that for reporting purposes. Other comments included, the battery scenario that Alva had proposed, ways that the hurdle rate could provide for some interesting outcomes. Discussion around the nature of the hurdle rate itself, its static or dynamic nature. I think the consensus was that it should be sufficiently dynamic to mitigate the predictability and potential gaming, if that's the right word, that could result in that. Whether or not it should be marginal price versus average price, there's some comments on both sides of that argument. The average price on the outside external would be more representative of the volume of energy flowing. The marginal would potentially, the marginal cost on the non-greenhouse gas side would potentially overcount the emissions that would be deemed into the greenhouse gas region. So these are some of the comments I captured on the importance of the hurdle rate. Certainly, many of these need to be continued to be fleshed out, but the general agreement was that the hurdle rate is the key to this unspecified approach. Then Kevin reviewed the transitioned the working group into the next topic for reporting, gave a brief review of what type of reporting comes out of California ISO markets now and how they're used in the CARB program and how they might be used or are intended to be used in other programs for Washington. And then he outlined what is going to happen over the next couple of weeks. And then embedded in that discussion was the homework assignment, which I think he covered clearly, and I won't reiterate here. That's all I have, Kevin. Back to you. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. I hope you guys all have a nice, pleasant weekend, and thanks for going back to back with us over the past 2 days. I appreciate everybody's feedback, and in particular, I'd like to thank Jeff and Mary for spending a lot of time with the unspecified approach, and I thought we all learned a lot. It's lots of conversations still to be had, but I thought this was another really successful week. So we are officially 1/3 of the way through this working group because we just finished meeting number 8, so 2/3 to go. Very exciting, and I hope everyone enjoys the time away from us, and then we'll talk on Tuesday. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.